this morning. So would you welcome John-Mark as he comes to share?
Thanks so much, Dave. Yeah, it's interesting, the connections that we've had. And so Dan was our supervisor in Africa when we did our missionary service, and so it was always felt a bit like a mentor to us, and I have stayed in touch with him over the years and heard how his ministry has been here as well. So it's great to be with you this morning. I feel like I'm going to be moving around because some of you are over here and some of you are over here, and I'm probably just going to wander a little if that's okay. And my style, I was also trained as a teacher like Dave and Jen, so I might even ask you some questions this morning. So are you okay with that? If I put you on the spot, you'll engage. I'd like you to open your Bible or open your app or whatever you have this morning of God's Word, and we're going to look at something from Matthew 5. As Dave mentioned, I've been doing some transition work, so I'm really thankful that Dan reached out to me and said, would you come and preach? Because I haven't stretched my preaching muscles in a while. It's been about a year, and in a way I feel like that was a gift, just to kind of have a sabbatical from preaching and just not be doing that, but I do enjoy it, and so I'm really thankful that I have the opportunity to share God's Word with you this morning. I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 20. I'm reading from the NLT. You can read along in whatever you have. Don't misunderstand why I have come, this is Jesus speaking. Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you'll be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is God's word to us this morning.
Amen.
I'm not sure where, I want to ask you a question maybe just to get started. Where does the word holiness or righteousness, what does it call up in you this morning? Is that a word that you have grown to love, or is it a word maybe that brings up in you ideas of meeting a standard or of being something that people have asked you to be? It's a word that certainly, if you talk about holiness in our wider culture, maybe with your non-Christian neighbors, you are likely to get some eye rolling at minimum, I think. People do, Christians are interested in this. And it sounds like a very religious word. It sounds like something that is often used to sort of give an idea of better than, right? Mostly what people beyond the church think about holiness is of holier than thou. That attitude of you're better. You've somehow attained some kind of moral superiority. It's also pretty likely, I think, maybe in the university classroom or in a group of young people, that if you talked about holiness, you might get some scoffers, like we read about in Psalm 1. There are going to be some people who say, I'm not really even interested in that. Whatever that is, I don't think that's what I want. The church that I was raised in, didn't happen to be the Free Methodist Church, but the church I grew up in, I think I absorbed a kind of implicit idea of what holiness was that was a lot about what we don't do as Christians. Maybe that resonates with you. We had a lot of things that we talked about reading the Bible in a particular way, about things that we shouldn't do, and there were certain activities that if we just stayed away from those, that would be our holiness, that would be our righteousness. And probably, to be fair, and I will say, the church I grew up in taught me how to understand the Bible, and I was baptized in that church, so I don't want to paint them with one brush, but probably what I absorbed as a person in the pew, as a young person, was that holiness was a kind of separateness that really was a bit judgy about everybody else. It was legalistic. It was conformity to a certain set of prescribed behaviors, things that Christians didn't do. As long as you avoided those, you were in the right way. I don't know if you have similar baggage. I'm getting older. I turned 50 this year. So some of you that are younger maybe say, oh, praise the Lord, that wasn't my experience of church. But that is certainly something that has pervaded our culture in the church and pervaded our wider culture, at least this idea that if holiness is anything, it's probably something that's a little judgy and not very attractive. My title this morning is Hammer or Seed. I'm going to come back to those pictures in a minute. But I had a dream a few years ago where I woke up thinking about, for some reason in my head, was holiness, hammer, or seed. And I think that the metaphor or the picture we have of holiness can make such a huge difference in how we approach Jesus, how we think about who God is, how we think about our own Christian lives together. The picture that we have in our heads, the idea that we use to understand holiness in our hearts, if it's a certain one, it could either help us, it could illuminate it, it could make it easier to understand, or maybe the picture that we have can actually obscure what Jesus is talking about when it comes to holiness. So my prayer this morning is that our hearts are open to thinking about holiness in the way that Jesus defines it, in having our pictures renewed and changed by what he said. So let me just talk about our text for a moment. We're talking about Matthew 5. Who knows, what do we call this part of Jesus' preaching ministry? Does anybody know? Sermon on the Mount. You probably heard of Sermon on the Mount before. Jesus goes to a place. In fact, I visited Israel a couple of times in recent years before the troubles they've been having there. And you can go to a place where they suspect, they don't know for sure exactly, but there's a very natural amphitheater in the hollow of one of the hills. And so there's a very old Catholic church that's built on the top. But just down below, there is a spot that many people think this could easily have been where Jesus gave his sermon, because by standing there, you can project to the crowds around you. They can sit sort of in a bowl in the side of the hill. And Jesus is here giving his Sermon on the Mount, which a lot of folks have said is like Jesus' manifesto, his kingdom manifesto. No, that's a fancy word. A manifesto is like any group says, what are we about? We're going to write down our manifesto. So there's a Communist Party manifesto. What does the Communist Party believe in? Where are we going? There's probably a manifesto for each of the Canadian political parties. What does it mean to be a conservative or a liberal? And Jesus here is setting out for his disciples, this is what my kingdom is about. And so he starts talking about all kinds of things. In our particular piece of this sermon, he is giving three things that I want to just draw your attention to. He's giving a clarification, an admonition, and a warning. A clarification, an admonition, and a warning. This passage that I read in just a few seconds ago comes after the Beatitudes, where Jesus talks about blessed are those who do this and that. Who does God's blessing really reside with? So he's taken some time to give some interesting ones. People who mourn, the weak, the meek, all of those people are blessed. And then after that he talks about salt and light, that the people that are part of his kingdom are going to live in a way that is different, that is noticeable, that is unmistakable, in a new way that people are going to see them. You can't miss what it is that they're going to be doing as part of the kingdom. So then we get to our verses this morning. So he's talked about the key kind of images of what the kingdom is and so on. And in this next little section, he's saying, but I want you to think about some things when it comes to holiness. What am I really talking about? I don't want you to get the wrong understanding. Verse 17, he says, don't misunderstand. He recognizes that his teaching about salt and light can easily be taken in a different way. People might say, oh, well, Jesus is giving us a brand new religion. We want to go and we're going to try something totally new. This is a total break with the past. And Jesus says, no, I'm not here to destroy what the Old Testament story is with God's people. I'm here to fulfill it. So Jesus gives us a huge clue here about what his purpose is. And the NLT that I read said it's to accomplish the purpose of the law. That's what Jesus is here for. I like that wording. Jesus is saying that God had a plan, he had a mission, in calling people, the people of Israel out, to say, I want you to be different. I want you to live in a new way. And Jesus' ministry, he's saying, I'm not here to scrap that. I'm not here to get rid of it. I'm here to fulfill it. There is a way that we can enter into the promise of God and the mission of God that is not to get rid of the things that God asked his people to do, but actually to bring them to their fulfillment. So in the passage I read, it said to bring about its purpose. What was its purpose? God was asking his people to live in a new way. Holiness, in the biblical sense, in a true biblical understanding, has this sense of the otherness of God. God is something totally different from what we can imagine. God is something that is a person, he's a being, whose three-in-oneness is totally distinct and separate. We sing the hymn, maybe not for a while, I haven't sung in a while, but it was an old hymn, Holy, 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 there is none beside thee. You have no equal, God. You're so unique and different. You have a unique character, a power, and a love. In the Old Testament, God began this relationship with the people of Israel, and he wanted them to become a peculiar people, as Peter says, thinking of them. That God wants us to become a people who are unique, that reflect who he is. And so as the Old Testament people of God walked in his ways, they became righteous. They were walking in a different way. They were having a way of living that projected and reflected who God was. That was the whole purpose of holiness. And they were to become, in the Old Testament, the phrase that is used is they were to become a light to the Gentiles. In other words, their holiness was not just for them. Their difference was not just for them. Their difference was to show people that there was another way to live with God. There's a lot of good news for us here. Maybe we're used to it. But Jesus is saying it's actually possible to live that life, to live with God in a new way. It's not, as some of our theological reflection over the years in church has led us, we say, well, maybe sin has the last word. You know, Martin Luther talked about being always a sinner. But sin, in Jesus' conception, does not have the last word. In fact, it's possible, Jesus says, to live in a fulfilled way and in a new way, in a kind of holiness that is life-giving, a new way of living. Jesus says that a relationship with him, with the Creator, is going to fulfill that Old Testament dream that God had of God being with his people. That God could actually have a relationship with his people. He could dwell with them. And Jesus is saying, I'm here to fulfill that. I'm going to make that happen. And the New Testament writers picked up on this. And in fact, if you want to understand what's happening in the New Testament, the way they use the Old Testament, I think this is key. That Jesus is the fulfillment of it. So some of the Old Testament law that was about taxation and about the theocracy of Israel simply doesn't apply anymore, so they set it aside. And some of it that was about the cultic aspects, where what do you do when you go to the temple? And of course, shortly into the history of the church, the temple is no more, so you can't even go to the temple anymore. So those things have fallen aside. But the heart of the law, the moral law, the law that God said he wanted to write on the hearts of Israel, Jesus is saying, I'm the fulfillment of that. If you want to get to that, if you want to live a life that's different, then it's through me. I'm the fulfillment. And so the New Testament writers could say things like about the church that they're the holy ones. This word that we translate as saints. They could say that early church, in spite of all their issues, I mean, you can't read the New Testament without knowing that the church had a lot of things they were still sorting out. And yet the writers can say, you are now God's holy people. Not because of moral perfection, but because you are living in a new way in the fulfillment that Jesus promised. A new life in the Spirit. So Jesus clarifies, the first thing he does, he clarifies that his kingdom is about holiness. It's about becoming this special people, a community that reflects God's character. And he says in there, an interesting thing that Jesus notes is, the law is not going to pass away until heaven and earth pass away. In other words, this thing that I'm doing, this project that God has to get a people who live with him and live as a reflection of his character, this is going to last until the next thing happens, the new age. This is going to be the whole thing until heaven and earth pass away. We haven't changed the plan. God hasn't changed his mission in the world. He's still drawing people to him to live in a fresh way with him. Second thing that Jesus does in this passage is he gives an admonition. Now, an admonition, who knows what an admonition is? I'm not trying to be fancy. I just think it's the right word. Yes, sir?
To encourage.
It is partly that, yes.
Urge.
You can say to people, I'm admonishing you, I'm rousing you, I want you to get started in something.
Urge. To urge people.
Yes, urge, that's a good word. Any other ones? I know it's not a word we use every day. But
Elements of correction?
yeah, so there's both. It's an interesting word. When I double checked it, because I felt like this was the right way to talk about this verse, it's both a bit of like, there's something important you need to be corrected on, and I'm also urging you to go into the right part of it. It has both negative and positive to it. And so in verse 19, Jesus says, you might approach holiness. One of the things that can happen here is as you come into my kingdom, we have a different way of reckoning greatness. If you discard the plan God has, if you don't really want to live with him, and you say these commandments are not worth doing and I'm not even going to teach them to anyone else, then you really, in the estimation of the kingdom, you're at the bottom, you're the least. But if you embrace this plan that God has to live with him in a new way, and you teach others to do the same, then you're the greatest. So Jesus talks, and he talks in other places about what it means to be a disciple. But here he's saying this is really the value that you have in the kingdom of God has to do with that obedience that you have to what God is asking of you. He's once again setting the terms of discipleship. Jesus doesn't lower the standard of discipleship. He doesn't say, oh, the law is nothing, you can do whatever you want. He says, actually, I'm asking for a new kind of righteousness, and the standard is obedience to what God has asked. You see this in the following verses. If you read on in the passage, and you'll be familiar with some of them if you've been around church at all, that Jesus talks about marriage, he talks about divorce, he talks about adultery, he talks about making oaths, and every time he says, you've heard it said, or the law of Moses says, but I say to you, and what he says to us actually raises the bar. He says, well, you've heard that you're not supposed to commit adultery, but I say, even if your thought life is set on that, that's something that needs to change. The inner person needs to change. So he clarifies that his purpose is to fulfill the holiness of God. He gives an admonishment. He says to his followers, there's something that I'm measuring in my kingdom that is different. There's a new way of reckoning greatness. And then thirdly, he gives a warning. So verse 20, let me read it again to you. I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. In a way, this warning of Jesus is another clarification, because there was a danger when he said, the greatest in the kingdom of heaven will obey the law and not neglect the law and teach it to others. The model that the people had in their head was who? Who was around showing great fealty to the law, great fidelity, great observance of the law? Who were the people at that time?
The Pharisees.
They had a religious structure, and they were, in the minds of the average person at the time, the average Jewish person, if they said, who really cares about the law? That's who they had in mind, the Pharisees. And so Jesus is warning them, I've said that you can be great in my kingdom, but it's not in the way that you think. It's not the Pharisee way. There's another kind of righteousness that you can have. And so to avoid that danger, Jesus is saying, you need something that is different in quality. You need something that is greater than what the Pharisees and the Sadducees and others have been doing. Now, why is that? Well, we have to actually have a look elsewhere in Matthew, and if you've read through the Gospel of Matthew, you may know that Jesus at a point in Matthew actually curses the Pharisees. He says, woe to you. And what is Jesus so upset about with the Pharisees? What is it that Jesus says is the issue with their type of religion?
Hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy? Yeah. Say a little more, anybody, about that.
They were overly legalistic, and it was quite meaningless in terms of how much substance it has.
Yes. So they were focused on the outward conformity to the law. If you think about, if you go to Matthew 12 or Matthew 23, you can read what Jesus says, but his famous indictment against them was to say, you're like whitewashed tombs. The outside is very pretty, but the inside is death. And so, of course, dead things in the Jewish ritual law, you didn't go near them. Dead things were bad. You didn't touch them. And he's saying your insides are all unclean, but your outsides look very good. And so it's that hypocrisy, that kind of outward conformity. You can look really good. You can actually even meet most of the standards or almost all of the standards of the law on the outside. You can be very religious. You can say, by the word of the law, I have done the things that the law had asked me to do. But the other thing I remember Jesus saying is about the widows. So there were laws around inheritance and how you could acquire someone's property and so on, but the Pharisees were going around scooping up the houses of widows to make a profit. And they were missing the heart of the law, which of course God had said that he wanted to care for widows and orphans. And so by the letter of the law, they had not done anything illegal, but by the spirit of the law, they were actually defrauding their neighbors. On the outside, everything was correct, but the heart of it was corrupt. We know that Jesus is saying here, the warning to his followers, the greatest in my kingdom will observe the law, but not in the way that the Pharisees were doing it. You're going to have a righteousness of a better quality. That word that I read in the NLT says is better, but in the King James it exceeds. Unless your righteousness exceeds. In the NIV it surpasses. The idea of that word, the Greek word that's there, is that you're going to need a righteousness that overflows, that is different. You're going to have a way of obeying God's law that comes from something that isn't just your own outward appearance. It's going to need to be abundant righteousness. In this passage, then, Jesus clarifies what his relationship to the Old Testament law is. He admonishes his followers, come into this kingdom and you can have a greatness in this kingdom, but it's a greatness of obedience. But then he warns them, you're not going to get there through the way that the Pharisees have been doing. Jesus believed that this kind of holy life with God was possible, and that he was at the center. His kingdom that he was announcing was going to fulfill it. This Old Testament intention that a people were going to be able to demonstrate God's life to others around them. He's starting that in a fresh way through his ministry. So how does this make a difference to us today? How does this even matter for Grapeview in the weeks and the months ahead? Is there something here for us this morning? I mentioned that dream about holiness that I had, and when I think about the Pharisees, I associate that with the hammer. That holiness was like a hammer. The Pharisees were looking at the law as a way to squeeze people into conformity, as a way to hammer at their neighbor to say, God wants you to do this, you must. And if you didn't fit into the shape that they wanted to hammer you into, then you were outside of the community. You were an outcast. Think of the scandal that happened when Jesus ate and drank with tax collectors and prostitutes. See, the Pharisees wouldn't even get socially close to those people for risk of being infected with their unholiness. It was a barrier to relationship. They were too far outside of God's holiness even for social contact. And Jesus shows that that's not the case. That holiness is not something for us to hit each other with or to beat each other into submission with, but there's something better going on. Perhaps you've had that happen in your own life, or you know of it in your family, where someone has had something going on in their life, and the response of the church or the response of people who call themselves Jesus followers is to hit them over the head with some holiness. You shouldn't be doing that. You should live differently. I think about, and this is showing my age because I'm talking about 80s TV, but I feel like when I was a kid growing up, every detective show or police show, there was always an episode where somebody got put in a car crusher. Do you know what a car crusher is? At the scrapyard. It was always like there was some kind of, somebody got knocked out and they woke up and they were in a car and the car was going to be crushed. It was going to be squeezed. A car crusher is this huge machine that they use where it doesn't matter what kind of car goes in, what shape it starts in, it squeezes the car, all the metal from every angle in it, and it creates a box of metal, like a square of metal at the end. Doesn't matter what you started as, it just crushes it down into, and each one of those fits neatly in a stack in the scrapyard. And I wonder if sometimes our conception of holiness, or the holiness that we absorbed from the church around us, that's what it is. We're going to just squeeze you into a box that all of you are going to look exactly the same. it's not something that is happening in us. That holiness that we've been absorbing has been something that people say it's happening to us. And maybe even in our conception of who God is, we think, well, I feel like I need change in my life, but the way that it happens is that God is going to hammer me into the shape He wants me. Circumstances or failures or things that happen are going to squeeze me in such a way that I'm going to come out the other side looking the way God wants me to look. And so holiness becomes something done to us instead of happening in us. It's exterior and not interior. And so if you've internalized that kind of a picture of a hammer, of a squeezing kind of machine that's going to produce sameness, that's not the holiness that Jesus is talking about. Jesus is inviting us into a different way of thinking about it. And through His sermon, through this kingdom manifesto, I think Jesus is giving us a better picture than the hammer. The life of holiness is not a mechanical process that crushes or pounds us or squeezes us. It's something that grows in us. Very different. Like a seed. Holiness is letting God's Spirit tend our hearts so the seeds of faith grow in our life. And we heard that in the song this morning. Now, I'm not sure what version the song was. It was fine. I'm going to just read verses 2 and 3 from the NLT from Psalm 1. They delight in the law of the Lord, meditating on it day and night. They are like trees planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit in each season. Their leaves never wither. They prosper in all they do. That's an organic image of holiness. That something grows in us, God's word begins to grow in us, and it's out of God's action in our inner person that we desire to live in a new way. They grow, they're nourished, they produce fruit. Holiness, as Jesus understands it, is life-giving. It's not life-constraining, it's life-giving. And seeds are small things. Seeds start out small. I don't know what the Old Testament, or sorry, the New Testament folks understood. I mean, obviously, people have always understood that a seed contains what's needed to create the next plant. They didn't know that DNA specifically was the thing that allowed that to happen. But if you think about what we know today, in every seed, in fact, in every cell, there is the information, the potential for growth into new life and to produce other lives. And so the seed of God's word, the seed of Jesus' presence in our lives, is often just a tiny thing to start. Maybe you've heard this other saying from Matthew's Gospel. Jesus said in 17:20 of Matthew, "You don't have enough faith. I tell you the truth, if you had faith even as small as a mustard seed, you could say to the mountain, move from here to there, and it would move. Nothing would be impossible." What if the action of Jesus in us, no matter how small, has all the potential of the kingdom to grow in us? And so if we believe in God's work in Jesus, if we have faith that His transforming life can begin in us, even the smallest seed of faith, even the smallest action can have tremendous power. Maybe you've been feeling stuck. I don't know where you're at in your Christian walk this morning. Maybe the idea of following Jesus or the life of faith is a little bit out of reach in your mind. It's over there. It's for other people. Or maybe you've been feeling in a particular area that sin has had the upper hand and you just feel like, I'm not moving forward on this. Maybe you've been trying in your own strength to say, I need to fix this, instead of saying, I need more of Jesus. There's an old song of a band that I like, a Christian group. The words go like this: all through the hours of the day, there's something strange growing. The seed of laughter and light way down inside you. It's a different kind of way of thinking, isn't it? All through the hours of the day, there's something strange growing. Instead of striving, instead of wanting to force ourselves or even hammer ourselves into a shape that we think we should be, what if we release some control and say, Jesus, you need to take over and grow in me what needs to happen in me. Seeds contain all that potential. And so if holiness is planted in us by faith, what might it grow into? Do we have that kind of vision, that imagination? What could holiness grow into if I allowed it to grow in my life? What could Jesus' life in me become? And when the seed of faith produces fruits of holiness in our lives, we become a people. I don't know if you think about Grapeview this way. Have you thought about Grapeview becoming God's holy people in St. Catherine's? Maybe we don't want to use that language. Maybe if we went to our neighbors and said, hey, I'm becoming God's holy people in my church. Yeah, okay. And in fact, maybe we don't even need to talk about it so much. Maybe we need to just allow it to happen and see if they notice. Jesus says right in the verse before our text today, in verse 16, he said, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so everyone will praise your heavenly Father. You know, we're in an interesting time, and I recognize a number of you maybe weren't born in Canada, or some of you came to Canada later in life, or some of you have lived outside of Canada and returned to Canada. We're in an interesting place in our history as a church in Canada, aren't we? We've had many, many years, in fact hundreds of years in the West, of Christianity being at the center. I'm pretty sure, if I know Dan, he's talked about this before. There was a time when the church was at the center, and now that the church is no longer in the society's mindset at the center, what does that mean for our relationship with those? Jesus said, let your good deeds shine for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. I think for a long time in our history, and I don't mean even the Free Methodist Church, I mean maybe the North American church in total, or at least evangelicals in North America, we've kind of been addicted to being right. We had our own Pharisee tendencies. We were addicted to being right. God's told us how to live. That's not the way to live, we would tell our neighbors. Or maybe our kids, or maybe our people in our extended family. And one of the side effects of this long history with Christianity is that we kind of became addicted to being right, and so when other people don't think we're right, we almost just want to get back to that. Can we just sort of force you to remember that we're right? Our way is right. And I think at this time in history, the church is being called to be more light than right. It's not that I don't think God's way is the way to live, but it's not going to come by me telling other people how to live. It's going to come by us together having a life that is more abundant, a righteousness that is of a better quality than simply a legalistic application of you should live differently. We're going to have a community of a greater quality spiritually, that people are going to say there is something going on there. Even though I have this baggage about what church should be, I'm still attracted to what's going on in that place or in that person's life. The seeds of something different are growing in them, and it's becoming salt, and it's becoming light. It's becoming like a city on a hill, Jesus said. You can't mistake it if God's righteousness is growing in you in that organic way, not in a Pharisee way, not in an external, showy way, but the secret places that are being changed by God's Spirit. You know, it's hard to trust the Holy Spirit. I've been a pastor for how many years now? Almost 20 years. I think we've struggled with this, haven't we? Not only have we wanted to be right and be seen as right, we don't even know that we can trust the Holy Spirit. We want to use our human control. Isn't this what the Pharisees wanted? They wanted to be able to say to people, you must do this, and if you don't do this, you're out. And they wanted to exercise human control of applying the law in such a way that we could clearly see who's in and who's out. It's conformity. Do these things exactly like this, and you're in. Trusting the Holy Spirit. Do we really trust the Holy Spirit? Do we pray into other people's lives for the secret work of the Holy Spirit in their heart, more than just wanting to see an outward change or an outward conformity to how we think they should live? And that can happen with our own kids, it can happen with our spouse, it can happen with ourselves. What if Jesus' life in us was that overflowing righteousness, a kind of righteousness that came from knowing Him and loving Him and outwardly transformed us, but it started on the inside? So where does this find you today? I've mentioned it a couple times. Maybe you're carrying some baggage from your own experience of church over the years, of feeling like you didn't meet a standard that someone had given to you. Maybe you've been given a model of Christianity that says, here's the box, now fit into it, like the car crusher. What kind of people are we becoming as bigger picture, as North American Christians, as evangelicals, as Free Methodists? What picture of holiness is actually in our minds and controlling our understanding of how we follow Jesus? Is it a hammer or is it a seed? Jesus is offering the seed of faith that grows in you. And if you receive that and allow him to cultivate it, allow that secret work of the Holy Spirit to begin in your heart, there's something strange growing down inside you. Are we allowing holiness to grow in us together to become a people that lives differently with their hearts transformed by Jesus? Can I pray for you this morning? Lord Jesus, you have pointed out in this passage that it's not by our efforts, it's not by a kind of outward display of our goodness, it's not a kind of who's in, who's out model and everyone looks exactly the same. It's a radical way of receiving your work in our lives and having that love relationship with you and saying, we love Jesus so much that even the hard things that he's calling us to do, his Spirit is enabling it with our humble, failing weakness. And you say, let me do the work. Let me come in and touch that place. And so this morning, Lord, I don't know all the needs in this congregation. In fact, I don't even know many of the names in this congregation. And yet your Spirit is here ministering to your people. So in the places that have been stuck in a hammer mindset, the places that have been hurt by others wielding that hammer of holiness, to the place maybe of discouragement or of exasperation, helplessness, or maybe we've been the one with the hammer in our hands and we know there are places we need to ask forgiveness of others for the way that we've been right but not loving. Father, do that work in us. Heal those places. Heal those relationships. Open up new avenues for your true holiness, your fulfillment of holiness in our hearts as your people. And remind us that you want to make us salt and light, a city on a hill. Unmistakably, something is going on with those people. God is doing a work in them. He's healing the old things. He's bringing about new life. The seeds are growing in their hearts so that they can't help but notice that you are changing us, not by our power or by our efforts or by our ideas, but because your life is growing in us. True holiness. Becoming a people that looks different because we love you and the things that you love. Father, do that work in me, I pray. Do that work in this church. Do that work in Pastor Dan and Kathy. Lord, call us all into that life where your seeds are growing in our hearts. And we ask this in your name.